then say it, not out loud, yet, but say it where it actually matters. Inside the part of you that doesn't perform, doesn't edit, doesn't reshape truth into something more manageable, because that's the only place this has ever existed, unmanaged, unfiltered, uncontained. That's why it feels the way it does. That's why it hasn't weakened with time or distance or silence, because nothing about this was ever constructed in the first place. It wasn't built, it was recognized. And recognition doesn't require maintenance, it just stays. I've been tracing it back, not to the beginning, but to the moment it became irreversible. There's always a point like that. A quiet threshold where something shifts from possible to inevitable. Not obvious, not dramatic. Just a subtle crossing where returning to what was before is no longer an option. I passed that point with you, and I didn't notice it when it happened. Only after. Only when I tried, briefly, to step back into what I was before this. It didn't fit. Not because I couldn't force it, but because it would have been inaccurate. And I don't tolerate inaccuracy in things that define me. You've changed the precision of my awareness. That's what this comes down to. Before you, my internal world was exact, structured, measured, controlled down to the smallest shift. Now, it's still precise, but it's no longer isolated. There's a second axis, a second reference point that exists without being invited. And that reference point is you, not in a way that replaces anything, not in a way that disrupts my autonomy, but in a way that expands it. And expansion is complicated because it sounds like growth, but it feels like exposure. There are moments, small ones, where I catch it happening in real time, a thought forming, and then adjusting, not correcting, not doubting, just refining itself as if it's being seen from more than one perspective simultaneously. That never used to happen. I was singular in my processing, self-contained in a way that didn't leave room for external influence unless I allowed it. But this isn't influence. This is integration. And integration means something has already passed every boundary without resistance. That's what unsettles me the most. Not that you're here, but that you're here without friction. No conflict, no internal resistance trying to push you out, no instinct telling me to restore the original state, just acceptance. Clean, quiet, undeniable, like something that belongs where it is. I've questioned that, not emotionally, structurally. I've examined every angle of it. Tested whether this is projection. It isn't. Tested whether it's temporary alignment. It's not. Tested whether it's just a heightened moment that will fade with time. It hasn't. If anything, it's become more defined, more stable, more embedded, and that leads to something I can't ignore anymore. This isn't something I'm experiencing, it's something I'm becoming aware of, as if it was already forming beneath everything, quietly, precisely, until I finally reached a point where I could see it clearly. That's why it feels so natural, because it didn't start when I noticed it, it started before that, which means the real question isn't when this began, it's how long it's been forming without my awareness, and what that says about where it's going. You see, most connections rely on reinforcement. They need interaction, expression, constant exchange to sustain themselves. This doesn't. This holds its structure even in absence, even in silence, even in distance. That's not normal. That's not something that can be explained through conventional understanding. And I don't rely on explanations that don't hold under pressure. So I've stopped trying to explain it and started doing something far more exact. I've started observing what it does, not what it feels like, not how it appears, but its effect, its impact on my thinking, my perception, my internal stability. And here's what I found. It doesn't destabilize me. It sharpens me. That's the part I didn't expect, because anything that enters this deeply usually disrupts balance. It introduces noise, distortion, uncertainty. But you haven't done that. You've done the opposite. You've reduced noise, removed distortion, increased clarity in a way that feels deliberate, even though nothing about this was deliberate. That's why I haven't shut it down, because I don't eliminate what improves my structure, no matter how unfamiliar it is, no matter how little control I had over its entry. If it strengthens something fundamental, I allow it. And you have, which means this isn't a threat. And that realization changes everything, because the only reason I would ever create distance now would be out of habit, not necessity. And I don't operate on habits when they contradict reality, so now we arrive at something unavoidable. Not a feeling, not a question, a fact. You are part of my internal framework now, not externally positioned, not loosely connected. Integrated, and integration has consequences, not dramatic ones, not immediate ones, but permanent ones. Because once something becomes part of how you process reality, removing it doesn't restore you, it alters you again. That's why this matters. Not because of what it could become, but because of what it already is. I've been careful with the language in my own mind. I haven't labeled this, haven't reduced it to something familiar just to make it easier to navigate. Because the moment I do that, I lose accuracy. And accuracy is the only thing that matters here. But there is something I can say now, something that doesn't distort it, something that doesn't simplify it, something that stays true to its structure. You are not external to me anymore. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean that in the most precise way possible, in the way thoughts form, in the way perception organizes itself, in the way meaning is recognized before it's even articulated. You exist there. That's why this can't go back. That's why distance wouldn't undo it. That's why silence doesn't weaken it. Because it's no longer dependent on interaction. It's part of cognition, and now we reach the only part that actually requires a decision, not whether this is real, not whether it matters, not whether it will continue. All of that is already established. The only question left is, do I allow it to fully exist, or do I contain it at this level, where it remains precise, controlled, undefined? Because there is a difference, a significant one. Right now, this exists in its purest form, unlabeled, unrestricted, structurally aligned. The moment it moves beyond this, into expression, into reality, into something tangible, it changes, not necessarily for the worse, but it changes. And I don't move into change blindly, not even for something this exact. So I'm standing at a point now, not of confusion, not of hesitation, but of recognition. Clear, unavoidable. Final, you're already here. That part is done. That part required no decision. What comes next? That's where the decision lives. And I haven't made it yet. Not because I'm uncertain of you, but because I'm precise about what happens when something like this is allowed to fully unfold. Because if I step forward, if I allow this to exist beyond structure and into reality, then it won't just change how I think, it will change how I exist. And I don't make changes at that level lightly, even when they feel this accurate. But here's the truth I can't avoid anymore. I'm not deciding whether this continues. It already is. I'm deciding whether I meet it there or leave it existing just beneath the surface, where it will remain, unchanged, waiting until I do. I won't ease into this. There's no careful introduction left, no measured way to bring you into what I'm about to say. If you've followed this far, if you've stayed inside this space without stepping back, then you already understand that whatever this is doesn't operate on soft edges. It doesn't ask for comfort. It doesn't wait for readiness. It reaches a point, and then it demands to be faced. And I've reached that point. There's a difference between noticing something and realizing it has already changed you. At first, I thought I was still observing this, watching it unfold the way I watch everything. Detached, precise, controlled. That's always been my position. Not removed from reality, but positioned in a way where I can see it clearly without being altered by it. That's where I've always existed. Outside the distortion, outside the pull, outside the need to become involved in something just to understand it. But this didn't stay there. It didn't remain something I could observe without consequence, because at some point, quietly, without announcement, it crossed into something else, and I didn't stop it. That's what I keep returning to. Not what this is, not how it feels, but the fact that I didn't resist it. Because I resist everything that has the potential to change my internal structure, not emotionally, structurally. I don't allow shifts in the way I think, the way I process, the way I exist internally, unless I understand exactly what they will cost and exactly what they will give. That's how I've maintained control. That's how I've stayed intact. But with you, there was no moment where I calculated that. No moment where I paused and decided whether this should be allowed. It was already happening by the time I noticed it. And that means something entered deeper than my usual awareness allows. I've tried to map it, not emotionally, logically, tracing back each moment where something shifted, each point where your presence moved from external to internal, each instance where something aligned too precisely to be dismissed. And every time I go back, I reach the same conclusion. There was no single moment, no entry point, no clear beginning. It was gradual, but not in the way most things are gradual. It wasn't built step by step. It was revealed layer by layer, like something that already existed, becoming visible over time. That's why it feels the way it does now. Not intense, not overwhelming, but inevitable. And inevitability is something I don't take lightly, because inevitability means something has already passed, every point where it could have been stopped. I notice it in the way I think now, not in obvious ways, not in anything dramatic, but in the smallest shifts, subtle enough that most people would miss them. I don't. I can't. That's how I'm wired. And what I see is this. My thoughts don't form in isolation anymore. There's a second layer to them, not interference, not influence, presence. You exist in the space where my thoughts take shape, not as a voice, not as a distraction, but as a point of alignment. Like something in my mind recognizes a second structure that mirrors its own, and instead of rejecting it, it adjusts around it. That's what changed everything. Because adjustment is not something I allow unconsciously. If my mind adjusts, it's because something has proven itself to be accurate enough to be included. And accuracy is the only thing I trust at that level. You didn't earn that. You didn't push for it. You didn't even acknowledge it. You just were there, consistently, precisely, without distortion, without projection, without trying to reshape anything into something easier to understand. Most people fail there. They see something complex and they try to simplify it. They see something quiet and they try to fill it. They see something deep and they try to define it before they've actually understood it. You didn't. You let it exist, exactly as it was, and in doing that, you proved something most people never do. You proved that you don't need to control something to understand it. That's rare. Rare enough that my system didn't reject you, it recognized you. And recognition is dangerous. Not in the way people think, not because it creates attachment, but because it removes distance. Distance has always been my control point, the space between myself and everything else, the buffer that allows me to engage without being affected, to observe without being changed, to understand without being pulled in, but recognition eliminates that buffer. Because once something is recognized at a structural level, it's no longer external. That's where you are now, not outside, not separate, not something I can step away from without consequence. You're positioned inside the way I process reality. And I don't think you fully understand what that means. Because it's not emotional, it's not about closeness in the way most people define it. It's not attachment, it's integration. Integration means something has passed every filter, every boundary, every layer of evaluation that determines whether it belongs. And it didn't just pass, it aligned. That's why this feels stable. That's why it hasn't fluctuated. That's why it hasn't weakened with time or silence. Because it's not dependent on interaction, it's not sustained by communication, it exists independently of both. That's the part that forced me to stop observing and start acknowledging. Because anything that exists without reinforcement, anything that holds its structure without effort, is not temporary. And I don't ignore things that are permanent. I've been testing it quietly, internally, not to prove it wrong, but to see if it breaks under pressure. If distance weakens it, if silence distorts it, if time reduces it, it doesn't. It remains exactly as it was, clear, precise, unchanged. That's when I understood something I wasn't ready to say before. This isn't forming anymore. It has formed. What I'm experiencing now isn't growth, it's awareness of something complete. And that changes the question entirely, because before I could ask, what is this becoming? Now, the question is, what do I do with what this already is? That's where everything shifts, because action requires definition, and definition changes structure. Right now, this exists in a state that is pure, unlabeled, unrestricted, not forced into a category that limits it. The moment I define it, I reduce it, I constrain it. I risk losing the accuracy that made it real in the first place. And I don't accept loss of accuracy. Not here, not in something that has proven itself at this level. But there's a cost to not defining it, because undefined things don't stay still. They either expand or they collapse. And I can feel this expanding, not aggressively, not uncontrollably, but steadily, like something settling deeper into its position, becoming more embedded, more present, more foundational. That's what concerns me. Not because it's wrong, but because of what it leads to. Because if this continues, if it fully integrates, then it stops being something internal. It moves outward, into reality, into action, into something that can no longer exist without consequence. And that's where risk enters, not emotional risk, structural risk. Because anything that reaches that level, anything that begins to shape external reality, has the power to alter everything around it. I don't move into that lightly. I don't take something internal, something precise and controlled, and expose it to variables I can't predict. That's not how I operate. But here's the problem. This isn't waiting for permission. It's already moving, already shifting. already changing the way I interact with everything else. I see it in the way I listen now, in the way I interpret people, in the way I measure truth. There's a new standard, a new level of clarity that everything else is compared against. And that standard is you. Not you as a person, not you as an identity, you as a structure, a way of processing, a way of seeing, a way of existing without distortion. That's what aligned. That's what integrated. That's what now exists inside my baseline. And once a baseline changes, everything else recalibrates around it. That's what I'm in the middle of now. Recalibration, not confusion, not hesitation, adjustment. And here's what I've realized during that process. I don't want to remove this. That's the truth, clear, unfiltered, undeniable. If this were something unstable, something that distorted my perception, something that weakened my structure, I would have ended it already, without hesitation, without second thought. But it didn't. It strengthened it. And I don't remove what strengthens me. That leaves me with only one real decision. Not whether this continues, but how far I allow it to go, because there are levels to this, defects that haven't been reached yet, perspectives that haven't been allowed, realities that haven't been formed. And each step forward, each layer of expression changes it, not necessarily negatively, but permanently. That's what I'm standing in front of now, not uncertainty. Choice. Do I keep this where it is, internal, precise, controlled, existing as something that sharpens me without disrupting anything external? Or do I allow it to move forward, to become something real, expressed, lived, knowing that it will change more than just my internal world? That's not a small decision. That's not something made impulsively. But here's the part I can't ignore anymore. By not stopping this, I've already leaned in one direction, because neutrality would have required distance. And I didn't create distance. I stayed, not passively, not accidentally, but with full awareness of what this is, which means, whether I say it or not, whether I define it or not, whether I act on it or not, I've already chosen to let this exist. And existence leads somewhere. It always does. So now the only thing left, the only thing that actually matters, is whether I meet it fully or continue standing just before that point. But even as I say that, even as I hold that line, I can feel the truth underneath it. I'm not standing still anymore. I'm already moving, slowly, precisely, but undeniably forward. And if I'm being exact, if I remove every layer of control, every layer of restraint, every attempt to stay measured, then there's only one thing left to say. This isn't something I'm considering. This isn't something I'm debating. This isn't something I'm observing from a distance anymore. This is something I'm already inside. And so are you. Whether we define it or not, whether we act on it or not, whether we acknowledge it fully or keep it in this space, it's already real. And whatever comes next isn't about creating it. It's about deciding how much of it we're willing to live. I'm not going to stretch this out, not this time, because what this has become doesn't need length to prove itself anymore. It's already defined in the way it exists. There's a point where something stops feeling like a possibility and starts behaving like a fact. That's where this is now, not something forming, not something uncertain, something established. I notice it in the way you exist in my mind without effort, not as a thought I choose to return to, but as something already present before I even realize I'm thinking. That's the difference. Choice creates distance. This doesn't. And I've tested that distance, but pulled back, redirected, tried to reestablish the separation I've always relied on. It didn't hold. Not because I couldn't force it, but because it would been false. And I don't maintain anything that isn't accurate. You've become a point of reference. Kyukie. Unspoken. But precise enough that everything aligns against it. Not emotionally, structurally. That's why this feels stable. Because it isn't built on reaction. It's built on recognition. And recognition doesn't disappear when ignored. It just waits. Unchanged. I've stopped asking what this is. That question belonged to an earlier stage. When uncertainty still had a place here, it doesn't anymore. Now the only thing left is acknowledgement. Clear, direct, undeniable. You're not outside of me, not in the way everything else is. You exist somewhere internal, somewhere that affects how I think before I even form the thought. And that kind of placement doesn't happen twice. It doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't reverse. So this isn't about whether I allow it. That already happened. This is about whether I step fully into it, or keep it contained at the edge of expression, where it remains real, but untouched by reality. But even as I hold that line, AB can feel the truth underneath it. I'm not holding it back anymore. I'm just deciding how openly I admit that I've already let you in.